We'll jump into today's episode right after this announcement. For over 13 years, something remarkable has been happening. Rural hospitals and other small healthcare organizations that have partnered with Capstone have been achieving results and forming workplace cultures that even we are blown away by. It is truly a game changer when rural hospitals are the provider of choice and employer of choice so they can keep care local and margins strong. Far more healthcare organizations need to experience what's possible. That's why we're stepping forward in a bigger way, expanding our team of experts, expanding our capabilities by adding a strategic planning division to expand our ability to help even more rural hospitals and other healthcare organizations in 2026 and beyond. Capstone will continue to be the partner that small healthcare organizations can count on to meet them where they're at and guide them towards a stronger future. You can learn more at capstoneleadership.net.
But sometimes that can be scary for a board who's rallied around independence for a while to say, well, what might life look like if we were to consider a partner? What resources might be available, or what trade-offs are there in our ability to take care of the community we know best? And so the motivation is always about being there for their community into the future.
Welcome to Culture Change RX, the podcast for healthcare professionals that are committed to creating a thriving workplace culture, improving the experiences of employees and patients, and ultimately unlocking their organization's next level of potential. I'm Sue Tetzlaff, your host and co-founder of Capstone Leadership Solutions. Join me and my insightful guests each week as we share actionable insights for navigating the crucial people side of the business of healthcare. Subscribe now for a weekly dose of Culture Change RX. Now let's dive into this week's conversation where culture change takes center stage.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Culture Change RX. It is me, Sue Tetzlaff, co-founder of Capstone Leadership and the host of Culture Change RX. Today is one of those episodes where I have a guest in the studio, and it is Chris Benson, and he is here with us today to talk about partnerships, mergers, acquisitions, affiliations, consolidations, and we're going to talk about that, and in particular, some of the cultural implications of that. So welcome to the show, Chris. If you could start by introducing yourself and telling us more about your organization.
First of all, thank you, Sue. I have listened to many of the Culture Change RX episodes, and they really resonate with me. By way of background, I started working in a hospital when I was 16 years old. I always knew that that's where I wanted to be. After graduating with a master's of healthcare administration, I joined Mayo Clinic and spent a couple decades there doing both operations. But then in my last role with Mayo, I was helping to set up provider relationships both domestically throughout the US and then also around the world. And in those relationships with Mayo, it was a way that we could work with other institutions and be able to share knowledge largely focused on the patient. This was not about the back office and revenue cycle and everything else. This was about providing great patient care. And that was done through some things, e-consults, access to high quality resources that were used internally to Mayo, such as protocols and evidence-based care resources. All that work had me in a lot of boardrooms and also meeting with a lot of management teams and executive teams. And through that work, I really began to see where sometimes systems have access to some resources that maybe are not available at smaller independent hospitals. And that's not a value judgment. It's just a different level of resource. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that. And so if you would, there always has to be a why for any of the work that we do, certain that your work has a strong why behind it. And I can hear it
Mm-hmm.
in your work. But my why is to, if you think about those sole community providers or areas where a hospital is taking care of the community in the absolute best way they can, I want to ensure that they have access to resources, whether that is through a partnership, of a clinical affiliation, a specialty affiliation, all the way up to a merger and acquisition, if that's what makes sense for the board and the community. So that's why I joined Juniper Advisory. Juniper Advisory is a very highly specialized firm. All we do is work with nonprofit hospitals who are considering a partner. And the very fact that this is the only work that the firm has done for 30 plus years provides some insight into, some of the common things that might happen as a hospital considers a partnership and ways to protect those both organizational and community interests through that. Important thing to note is that when we work with boards and teams, about 50% of the time that someone works with us, they might choose to remain as they're currently configured.
Mm.
And ultimately, this is the board's duty. It's the board's sole responsibility. While we might advise on process and help ensure that they've considered all the options, we don't make a selection for them. That's only something a board can do. Sometimes that option is looking with real world feedback and understanding that, they're in the best spot for their community and for their organization.
Mm. Wow. That stat kind of surprises me, but yeah, at least they arose at that decision with a really good process guiding them to that decision. What are the types of hospitals, Chris, that you're primarily working with in these recent years, and what's motivating them to go down this path, even if it might result in we're going to do nothing, we're not going to change anything?
We work with all types of hospitals, be them public, which would be a district hospital, city hospital, a county hospital. Quite a bit of work with them right now for some really unique reasons we can talk about. Of course, work with faith-based organizations, self-perpetuating 501c3 organizations, which really between those two, they make up the majority of hospitals in the US. We sometimes will work with a for-profit chain. Oftentimes, they might see a certain hospital that they have that maybe doesn't fit in with their kind of core geography or portfolio, and sometimes that's a better fit with one of the more local community partners as well. So we work with all types of hospitals. From a size perspective, and not surprisingly, it's on the smaller side. And so while we'll work with absolutely any hospital, we find that most often they're in the, and I don't want to be crass in investment banking terms, but oftentimes we describe the size of a hospital by their annual revenue. There's so many other things that can change, whether they've got outpatient services and, skilled nursing facilities or long-term care facilities. And so the one thing that really helps describe and cuts through that is the annual revenue of the hospital. So not being crass, but that's the way we oftentimes,
I actually go there too myself.
yeah. So the size is oftentimes, we'll say 100, 150 million, all the way up to $2 or $3 billion systems as they are considering what's best for them. You asked about motivation. Community boards and hospital boards and hospital system boards, none of these dollars go in their pocket. It's entirely to say we want to carry on our mission, and the groups that we work with are boards who are looking into the future and looking at their resources and saying, how is it that we can remain the employer of choice? How is it that we can keep care local? And they want to understand what those options are to do that. It can be scary. There are a lot of boards who have found
Mhm.
themselves describing their strategy as independence, which, independence alone is not a strategy. It's a position no more than being a system is a strategy. But sometimes that can be scary for a board who's rallied around independence for a while to say, well, what might life look like if we were to consider a partner? What resources might be available, or what trade-offs are there in our ability to take care of the community we know best? And so the motivation is always about being there for their community into the future.
Pausing here to get healthcare executives excited about Capstone's 14th annual Healthcare Executive Forum. Many small and rural healthcare organizations are operating under conditions that naturally strain margins, workforce stability, and long term competitiveness. Strength today requires more than perseverance, it requires intentional design and doing. And that's why the focus of our Healthcare Executive Forum this year is on designing the future. It's all about where strategic clarity meets execution certainty. This isn't just another conference or networking event. This is where rural healthcare executives learn how to lead their organizations to true organizational vitality. If your plan or your ability to execute it is in question, if progress feels incremental instead of transformational, it may be time for a trajectory changing strategic period. Be a leader in rural healthcare's new era, the era of organizational vitality. Register now and bring your executive team. It is true that the next 3 years may be the most defining period your organization has faced in decades. Visit capstoneleadership.net and click on upcoming events. See you in June in Madison. Mm. I'm just wondering on a national perspective and landscape, how much activity of this is going on? To me, it looks like there's a lot of activity, and there has been a lot of activity over the years to change the status of independent versus part of a system. And so, how much per year? Like, how much is going on?
I agree with you. You hear about a lot of consolidations or mergers or acquisitions or somebody partnering with somebody, specifically with change of control transactions. So those are not light affiliations. These are instances where an organization has chosen to team up completely, meaning a merger and acquisition where that change of ownership goes from where it was to a new model. It's only about 80 per year that actually go through that. If you look all the way back to 20 plus years ago, there was a bit more activity in the late 1990s, largely focused on external stimuli like managed care and needing to take care of populations. During the pandemic, you saw that the volume of transactions went lower, considerably lower. And that's the right thing because teams from hospitals or systems were not thinking about, what's our strategic future. They're thinking about how can we take care of our community
Mhm.
right now. We've seen a rebound from that. There are those hospitals that, had a few really solid years, both by the volumes and some of the specialty funding, the CARES Act funding. And so that helped to buoy the hospitals. It did what it was supposed to, buoy those hospitals so they could be there for their community. But overall, it's about 80. Now, we have to mention that for smaller hospitals, especially in rural areas, there's unfortunately also a number of hospitals that are either going through some troubles that lead them to have to not be there for their community. And no one wants
Mhm.
that for their town.
Mhm.
No one wants that for the people that live there. Luckily, there is that rural emergency hospital designation. We see that as well. But about 80 per year actually choose to find a partner. If you, and maybe too much inside baseball, but 73% of hospitals right now are in a system. Importantly, though, that's a system of two or more hospitals. And so there's been a lot of consolidation where maybe a neighbor and a neighbor come together. I know that's happened somewhat in Michigan more recently. So that's an example of a system hospital, more than one. And then
Mhm.
there's obviously some of the larger systems as well, but there's still over 3,900 hospitals in the U.S. overall.
Wow. You had shared with something in one of our earlier conversations on this, and I enjoy so much learning more about this from your perspective and having these conversations. But I thought it fascinating that in healthcare, when you compare hospital affiliation, those top 10 compared to the top 10 affiliations of insurance companies or even aviation or airline companies, there's a big difference in really what's going on when it in general business, how you compare it. So can you share a little bit about that? Because I thought it was fascinating and provided an something I hadn't thought about before.
Yeah, absolutely. Oftentimes we hear about, I'm guilty of this as well, thinking about those big systems that, really rule healthcare throughout the nation. When we actually look at the facts, and the reason this is especially relevant is healthcare is capital intensive, it's highly regulated, and it's high stakes. If you look at the top 10 hospital companies. So think Advocate, Kaiser, Tenet, HCA, Dignity, that group. If you look at the top 10 largest players, you account for about 20% of the overall hospital market in the US. So 80%, are not. If you do the same thing, look at the 10 highest insurers, that's Aetna and Humana and Kaiser in there again, United, they account for 65% of the total market. You can see a big economic power inequity between hospitals and payers, and that another I guess industry to consider is the airlines. You take the top 10, American, Delta, Spirit, United, it's 92%. And so we've
Mm.
seen that in banking, in airlines, large consolidation on a national basis where they are still competing, but from a much different level. The insurers at 65% for the top 10 and the hospitals at 20% for the top 10. You can just kind of see it's oftentimes not
Mhm.
a fair fight for hospitals. Where hospitals overall in the nation, for that very reason, are price takers, not price makers. And it's one of the things that makes the business incredibly difficult right now for everyone.
Yeah. You mentioned about kind of the smaller size organizations being around that 100, mark or so, all the way to the big ones. Of course, in our work at Capstone, we are primarily working with smaller independents. There's been a few of the organizations that we've worked on helping them grow and improve. And they've been part of a larger system, but they've been one of the smaller hospitals associated with that system. One of the things I was thinking about related to this is our bigger systems, not those ones that just have two or three, but some of the bigger systems, are they starting to lose their appetite for these smaller hospitals? Because it seemed like for a while, I mean, I'll just use a very unprofessional or, jargon of they seem to have been gobbling them up for a while, the smaller rurals. And I'm not seeing as much of that activity, like, because that's the circle I run in. I'm not seeing as much of that activity right now. And I don't know if it's on the independent rural hospital side that they're not initiating it or if the systems aren't encouraging it, or maybe it's a little both. What do you see?
There was quite a bit of consolidation, like I had mentioned in the late 90s, but the level was still quite high. If you look at the last couple of years, and maybe we'll just bring it to the current, there are persistent financial challenges, both labor costs and the compounding costs of all the things it takes to run a hospital. Now you bolt on or couple that with uncertainty around Medicaid directed funding and other things that really help rural hospitals stay there for their community. I'd say that when a larger system considers whether or not they would like to partner with a hospital, it matters if the hospital is doing well. Right now, I don't think a lot of larger systems are looking to, expand risk or have another mouth to feed. The best future, and this is something we said at Mayo all the time, is there's really no future for high cost, low quality care. And so the safest thing any executive team can do is really focus on that value equation, improve quality and lower cost so that you can have that margin to reinvest. Those hospitals that find themselves in a situation where they can do that, they preserve options for their community. And we are still busy right now. We are still working with a number of hospitals who, both rural and in smaller markets, who are very desired by larger systems. And one of the questions we asked all the time is, why do systems want to grow? If you think about the larger system motivation, they too are competing. They need to be relevant. They need to be relevant both in their geography. They need to have enough care access points so that they can take care of the entire community. That makes them much more attractive to insurers as well, or employers who are looking to say, no, I don't want you to just take care of half of my employees. I want you to take care of them all. So that relevance in a
Mhm.
community is the first. The second one is revenue. And, I try to be alliterative here with the R's. And so revenue is more about that scale. How can a system look at its fixed costs, all of those things that they need to provide good care, and how can they spread that and gain some of those scale economies? And the last one is regional integration. You can't duplicate every service at every single hospital, and some of those tertiary, quaternary, some of the most complex care. You need to be very thoughtful about how you offer that so that you're not duplicating, so that regional integration with a large enough care system allows them to make really wise decisions. One just really simple example of that is sometimes the ologies are really difficult for rural hospitals to have. And so that's rheumatology, it's infectious disease, it is neurology. Some of those non-procedural specialties where they don't necessarily have the economics to offer are still really important for the population. If you have two hospitals that are working together, you have a better chance to have the population that can support, 1.0 FTE or 2.0
Mm.
of those, whereas on a small hospital, they might not need that. Now, some of that could be solved through partnerships or clinical affiliations that bring some of that outreach into town. But overall, as you think about that scale, regional integration is really important. So those three reasons, again, are relevance, revenue, scale, and regional integration.
That makes sense. You also use an example that resonates with me related to combines. And, as you speak about this benefit of scale and that analogy, any analogy kind of helps me understand something anyway, but because we mainly work with small and rural and, most hospitals we work with are in cornfields, it made sense to me. So what do combines have to do in this analogy with scale and the health of small rural hospitals and this idea of possible partnership?
Well, forgive me. I should have mentioned right at the top that I was born in Iowa. So corn and beans, grains are important, and so I was thinking about how family farms experienced a great change over the past 40 years, and the size of farms increased, and economies of scale. Sounds like something an economics professor would talk about, and how does that matter to a hospital, or how does it matter to a farm? And so the analogy is really to think about a smaller farm, and if they need to buy a combine, it's an extraordinary expense. That expense needs to, if you think about bringing on that asset and you're going to have to make the payments on that, you need to make sure you can support it. And depending on what grain you're working with, industry figures show that you need 1,500 or 2,000 acres of grain. I'm not an expert on that, but what it does tell me is that if you have a 600-acre farm and you take on a combine yourself, doesn't really matter how much you care or how long you've been there or how smart you are or how earnest you are or how hardworking you are, you're going to be facing some headwinds just to make that work. And that's really that economy of scale. Now, it's also a really good analogy because hospitals, one way to do that is be part of a 2 or 3 hospital, 2 or 3 farm scenario where you are ensuring that your fixed assets or those really expensive economic resources are used at their fullest ability. That can be done a number of different ways. It could be partnering with the neighboring farm. It could be, working with the neighboring hospital, all the way up to, joining into a system so that you could use those resources. The point here is hospitals. We have a lot of combines. We've got electronic medical records. We've got a lot of things on the horizon about technology, and I try not to say AI, but AI, and how to bring those best in class treatment modalities to the local population. You want to have everything that someone is
Mhm.
offering, and sometimes it's really difficult to do on your own, let alone
Mm.
the ability to diffuse that. So it's not enough in a system to know how to do it really well at the biggest hospital. You need to be able to diffuse those evidence-based care methods or those technologies into the smaller systems. And so it's both economies of scale, but then also economies of skill. It can be really, really difficult. And I just want to acknowledge the fact that independent hospital executive teams, it's a really tough job right now. It takes a lot of grit to cover
Mhm.
regulation, to cover clinical quality, to cover financial acumen, community engagement, and everything else. And those that are doing great, absolutely, that's fantastic. For those that also sometimes see, the battle's getting difficult, more difficult every day, that's where, again, we just want to be able to bring options.
Mhm. And it really, when you look at making a decision like this, or at least going down the pathway to making a decision about this, I mean, certainly there are those economic factors, but there's a lot of, it sounds like, non-economic factors at play too. And so I'm really curious about the process. I'm a process and systems geek, so I'm really curious about the process of, let's say I'm a hospital board and it's on our strategy to maybe not do this, but at least investigate or start the conversation or exploration of this. And I kind of break it down into the before they decide, deciding, and after they decide. So maybe you could talk about, you don't have to give away your secrets, I guess, if they're secret sauce, but
No, we'll share it all.
what's the process of how do you engage with them in this work to make such a forever trajectory changing decision for these organizations?
We talk with hospital executive teams, CEOs consistently, and I'm willing to talk to anyone. I don't want to ever presume that they need to be thinking about this. Oftentimes, it's just comparing notes about what's going on in the region, how others are choosing to navigate some of the headwinds that every hospital are facing. And through those conversations, sometimes there will be a change, or the board will actually say that we want to understand, we want to not just look at our current configuration. We want to consider what it would be like so that we can measure and test that reality versus what we are today. And those times, what we'll do is actually come and meet with the board. And oftentimes we might label it as an independence assessment, but what it really is just a discussion of both national, regional, and local trends, looking at the providers' systems around them, looking at their peers, and taking a look at their results, both from a quality perspective for with the publicly available measures. So, are you doing a good job of taking care of your community? And we also look at some of the financial measures. And the financial measures are important because you can set your bar as an independent board or any board at survive or sustain or thrive. And those are all different measures, and we've got ways to define those. But largely, survive is just being able to cover your costs and
Mhm.
be open for your community. Thrive is having a margin that allows you to cover your depreciation and then maybe a bit of investment. Survive is really where you have a healthy enough margin so that you can continue to invest in both clinical service lines and equipment and all the other things, all those combines we talked about earlier. And so, in those discussions, as we're working with the board, there's sometimes when the board will say, okay, we've heard that information. We've most certainly not made a choice that we want to have a partner, but we do want to, exercising our duty of care, we think it's the right thing for our board to understand what that is. And so that's when we kind of move from that pre decision to say an exploration. And it's really important for me to say this is all board driven. The board has the only fiduciary duty. We don't. They do, and it's the board's decision to say if they choose to do this. And so that process is one that, just like you, we are process and systems geeks, or big fans, we should say. And the process that we start with is really to have that board, with both the board, the executive team, and other key stakeholders, both sometimes in the community and other key stakeholders in the organization, establish a list of objectives. What is it that, if they were to consider a partnership, what is it that they would want to solve? That's usually a list of, I don't know, 6 to 8 items: clinical care, a good culture, a sustainable financial performance. And so we codify that. We take that back to the board through a number of interviews. And then the board says, yes, we agree, or we don't agree with some of these. Let's get this right. That's really important because you need a true north, because the whole
Mhm.
process can take anywhere between 6 to 9 months, and you want to always be able to remember why you set out on that journey, and then have a way to measure about, as you're starting to get feedback from potential partners, you can start to look to say, does this match up? Are we achieving the goals that we set out to achieve? And so we establish those objectives. We cast an intentionally very broad net for partners. So one of
Mm.
the things that we do is always ensure it's not just solving for, we close the doors in a room, we get a bunch of smart people in there, all the right key stakeholders, and we say, that's our partner and this is our structure. Time and time again, we've been absolutely surprised, and boards have been delighted at potential partners who they didn't think of, or potential structures and ones that match those objectives coming forward. And so, not to belabor this, but with those objectives and those partners, we ask partners to do a first indication of interest, and they have access to a bunch of information after they've signed a non-disclosure that tells them about the hospital and the opportunity and the community and the clinical performance and the facilities and all the other things that they would need to really get to know. And so they put forward an indication of interest. So you go to a bigger group, and then it's a smaller group that chooses to indicate interest in that first round. The board looks at that, and because of what I'm about to talk about, they really narrow that group down, maybe to 3 to 4 that they want to learn more about, because that vision of what was communicated is compelling and worth looking into. And so, in that next phase, those groups that the board has selected, there's a lot of human interaction. There is a chance for the, I'll just use partner to come on, the potential partner to come on site for a half day to meet with the board, meet with the executive team, tour, and really share that vision of working together. And I think really, boards have such astute community and business members on them, that they can oftentimes hear from that presentation whether there's a cultural fit, whether
Mm.
they care about the same things that we do in our community. And so after those are done with all of the partners, then another group will, a smaller subset, oftentimes members of the board, members of the executive team, other key stakeholders. We always really, really encourage that to have physicians. And this is not just a group of people that all are, pro partnership. We encourage that to have a very diverse set, because you need to ensure all of the community and organizational stakeholders are represented. They go on site to the potential partners, and they oftentimes visit the headquarters to understand what the systemness means. What value is it? What resources are available to provide the best low cost care in the community? We also encourage and take those same intact traveling groups to a recent hospital that has recently joined their system, and
That's a great
it's a
idea.
chance. Yeah, well, who knows best than someone who's been in
Mhm.
that partnership, how, whatever flavor the partnership is, and can say, here's how things went in our relationship between system and site, or system, when things were going well, when things weren't going well, here's how it was dealt with in both directions. And then they can say, have they kept their promises? And so through that, you have a pretty comprehensive understanding of that partner's, both those resources that are available, and then how those system site dynamics play out in all cases. Coming to an end here, but then there's a second round after those visits where the partner now knows the potential system better, and they have an ability to put in that second indication of interest. And oftentimes this is going to have more of the economic terms. So like, what is the capital commitment for service lines, for facilities, for diagnostics? It'll also have those non-economic terms. What are treatment of people that are on staff? What are those commitments, those non-economic commitments that are equally important about what how that hospital will be treated through that? And the board might look at those 3 or 4 options, and they might say we like one, or they might say this was a good experience and we've learned a lot more. We want to remain as we're currently configured. In the instances where they do say they want to focus on one partner, then we've got a really good, I guess, trail of communication, both from the first indication of interest to the second, I guess, proposal that then can help create all the legal documents, the letter of intent, down to a definitive agreement, and work through some of those issues at that point. And there's more diligence after that. But what you're hearing is it's a very stepwise process. And
Mhm.
along the way, the board at the first indications of interest could say to us, you know what? Nothing of that was compelling. It doesn't happen very much. They oftentimes want to get to know the partners. They could say it again as the second offers come forward. The board has an off ramp and could say, "Thank you, but I think we're fully informed." And there's a few more cases there that the board can again remain in control and select what they best want. So long answer, but it's a
Mhm.
really good process, and the goal of that is to, if we've done our work, it's to maximize and equalize the, let's say, economic and non-economic offers so that the board can
Mhm.
pick on culture. And rarely
That's
is
music
it
to my
that one.
ears.
Yeah, I figured, yeah, that's the prescription right there. No, we agree with that in every way. The culture is so important, and if we can make the terms the most equal, it's rare that one of
Mhm.
our organizations or clients that we work with will choose solely based on
Mhm.
economics.
Like, it reminds me of, marriage inherently is not a bad or good thing, right? But if you're gonna be married, you wanna have a great partner. So, if you're gonna stay independent, you wanna be very happy and live a great life independent, but if you get married, you wanna make sure you have the best partner, right? So, I think that applies here. So, I was thinking about too, you mentioned that there's these smaller affiliations that are going on of like 2 hospitals nearby or 2 or 3, so they're not this big, huge system, and maybe there's no big tertiary mothership part of it, and it's just the small independents collaborating together for that scale and all those resources and some of those things that you're looking for. And we've had the joy in our work to be able to work with a couple of those smaller 2, 3 hospital organizations, and it's been really fun to work with them to help them on your scale thrive in that way, and also really be able to merge their cultures, not just their resources. So yeah, certainly some benefits to these kind of partnerships and relationships between organizations. And if they're going to do it, you just want it to be the right decision and to go well, and really meet those objectives that were set in the beginning. And sometimes that does fall short, just like but I don't see too many divorces going on out there when it comes to once they're matched, it seems like untangling it is not a common thing. So
Yeah,
so
can
you
I
want to
say
make the
just something about
decision
that?
right. Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. That's one of the things that we really pride ourselves on, is through that very systematic process that I just belabored a bit ago. That process really tests both vision, but it tests intent. And with a larger, or with any partner who is making a commitment, sometimes, a significant capital commitment, the last thing they want to do is have the hospital not be a great asset for the community. It's a value, it's part of them.
Mhm. Mhm.
There's this point in the process where there's a we versus them. And then as the organizations come together, they realize it's just we. And
Mhm.
one of the things that we hear is, concerns that like all political things, there's a catchy little coin phrase that is Band-Aid station. People don't want to become a Band-Aid
Mhm.
station.
Yeah.
We actually did some research and looked at the, obstetrics. That's near and dear to many communities, and it's also
Mhm.
really important for communities. System hospitals are, regardless of where they're at, rural or not, are more likely to have obstetrics than independent hospitals. And I think that's because of some of that scale benefit where you're able to, increase your margin a bit across the entirety so that you can keep those service lines open. Now,
Mhm.
hey, there's a lot of stories about, systems closing that, and it doesn't fix everything. But there are a lot of instances where an independent hospital has to make that same difficult decision. And
Mhm.
so I definitely want to acknowledge that not everything is sunshine and rainbows. There is a trade-off, and we want the boards to be eyes wide open about what those trade-offs are as they're going into the relationship.
Mhm. Yeah. Our work is, like I mentioned, it's all small and rurals, and most of them being independent. And most of our work with them is strategy execution around improving, growing, thriving. And a lot of the boards I work with, they really do take a lot of pride in being independent and have a long term vision for that. But what I say to them is being great and strong and thriving in people, service, quality, finance, and growth, being a truly a magnet for talent and patience in your community, and being a preferred provider and employer, and being able to grow and increase your revenues and higher margins on those revenues. That all of that's important, yes, to maintain independence, but it's just as important if you decide to go down this other exploration of partnerships. Is you want to go into that in a position of strength, not weakness, and not feeling like you're being rescued or at the mercy of their terms because, yeah, or maybe not even being desirable. It's really important to, for whether they're independent or not. I'm all about great care and strong healthcare organizations and local care, even in rural areas. But sometimes the way to do that is through some sort of partnership or affiliation. And if it means some things like keeping OB there for their community, that might be one of those 6 or 8 factors that come into play. So, yeah, I know it was hard to take such a big topic and a big decision and pack it into an episode, but I appreciate your wisdom coming forward to our audience on this. It is certainly something that impacts culture of healthcare, the people in healthcare, and I appreciate your insights on what you do through Juniper Advisory to be able to help advocate and assist in the process of this big decision. Anything else in final comment that you wanted to mention? And certainly, let people know how to reach out to you, learn more. I know you do writing and you have information on your website and stuff, and maybe connect with you on LinkedIn. So we'll put some of that in the show notes. But anything you want to put a plug in for here, or any final comment or remark, happy to take that right now before we end today's show.
I would just say that thank you to both the board members and executive teams who take care of their communities and do so with such great intent. I understand rallying around independence, and to the extent that you can have a balanced scorecard that looks at your service to your community, service to your patients, ability to be sustainable. If you are, mostly green on that balance scorecard on the stoplights, you're doing a great job. And, I have no doubt that Capstone can help make that even, more durable. And then if you start to see a few yellows and a few reds, there is some wisdom in saying, what might this look like at our current position? And really what the best thing to do is have options for the future, and you do that by taking the best care of patients and taking the best care of your community in any scenario. That's the winning way to go about healthcare.
Yeah, wonderful. And so we'll put your website. We'll put your LinkedIn connection in the show notes so people can connect if they want to learn more or reach out if their organization is in need. So thank you again, Chris, for being here today.
Thanks, Sue. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for tuning in to Culture Change RX. If you found value in today's episode and you are a believer in fostering change in healthcare, join us in making a difference. Follow, rate, and review our podcast on your favorite platform. Share it with colleagues and your network. Together, we can make a lasting impact. Until next week, keep inspiring positive change.